To illustrate what I mean by the big wrong, imagine going back to ancient Eridu, right, which was in what is modern-day Iraq. In Eridu, you talk to the people there. You learn their ways. You live through their crop cycles and festivals and marriages and family fights and small-scale conflicts that you wouldn't quite call a war. You live through it all, and you get to know these people very well. And one day, you decide to tell them three things. Tell them three things. The first thing you tell them is how to make their irrigation system more efficient. The second thing you tell them is that Enki, who is their patron deity, doesn't exist, that their god doesn't exist. The third thing you tell them is that they should kill their firstborn. So what would their reactions be to each of these three statements? Well, to the first statements about irrigation, they would test your modification, and if it worked, they would apply them generally and then thank you, presumably. Whenever we see a general technological modification, no power seems to have any problem with them unless it conflicts with something else they believe. So I think this is a fairly safe assumption. For the second statement, which is where you deny their patron deity, they would probably denounce you and perhaps banish you. Hard to say for sure. Now, for the third statement, that you should kill the firstborn, well, maybe they would banish you. Maybe they would certainly denounce the proposal. Perhaps they would see you as being mentally ill, although I don't think at the time they had a concept of mental illness, and so would probably just punish you. But for statement number 2 and 3, certainly we would say that their reaction would not be positive. Okay? So the first statement, they would, right, if your technical proposal worked, they would implement it just fine and move on. For the second two, they would have negative reactions of varying degrees, right? Depending on what mood they were in, even would influence how they would react to statements 2 and 3, where you deny their deity or say that they should kill their firstborn. Anyway, then you go on to another city. You go to Babylon, and you do the same thing in Babylon. And at the end of it, you make 4 statements. The first one is that you show them how to make more efficient chariots. Okay, apparently they have chariots. Okay, so you show them how to make various modifications and improvements to have better chariots. The second statement you say is that Enki, who is the patron deity of Eridu, the city you were just at, doesn't exist. The third statement you make is that Marduk, the patron deity of Babylon, doesn't exist. And then for the fourth statement, you say that they should kill all women after bearing 3 children. Okay. Now, the reaction to statement number 1 would be to, if history is any guide, would be to test your modifications, right, and change their chariots, and then they would thank you. Right? They would say, oh, this does work. Oh, this suspension modification does work. Thank you. And that would be that. The reaction to statement number 2, where you denied Enki, the patron deity of Eridu, would be confusion. They would ask, who is Enki? Where is Eridu? Some of them who are more well-traveled, maybe a few of the merchants, would know about Eridu, but for most of them, they would just be confused and go on about their day, forgetting what you said. Right? Now, the reaction to statement number 3, where you deny Marduk, the patron deity of Babylon, well, it would certainly be negative. Maybe they would banish you. Maybe certainly some of them would denounce you. Some of them would close their doors to you, depending on how, or maybe they would, we know how religions work. Some of them are more hostile than others. Some of them kill atheists. Some of them just shut off from atheists. Some of them banish. There's all sorts of, I don't know exactly what they would do, except that it would be a negative reaction. What would their reaction be to the fourth statement, that they should kill all women after bearing 3 children? Well, again, these people have no concept of mental illness, and so the reaction to that would be negative. I'm not sure exactly what it would be, but it would be negative, okay? Let's go take our time machine and go a little bit further into the future. If you were to travel to the Soviet Union under Stalin, you could propose scientific changes that would produce more efficient steel production or more ore extraction. These would certainly be tested and then implemented, and you would be thanked for your contributions to the cause. But if you went before the Politburo, apparently the Politburo is listening to you, but if you went before the Politburo and presented evidence that Enki, or Marduk, the patron deities of Eridu and Babylon respectively, that they didn't exist, well, the people at the Politburo would be confused as to why you're bringing them up. Some people in the Politburo who are more well-read about ancient history may know what you're talking about. Most of them wouldn't know what you're talking about, but even those who did would be perplexed as to why you're pointing this out. Right? Enki and Marduk are their gods, not the gods of the Soviet Union. Now, if you went before the Politburo and presented evidence that Marx's ideas were bogus, and that the transition to stateless communism was ultimately impossible, and that the Bolsheviks were really a brand of thugs, and that the white armies of the Russian Civil War were actually mostly social democrats, they weren't monarchists, and so the story that they're rising against monarchism is a big myth, right? If you said all these things, you would probably be sent to the Gulag, maybe for re-education, or maybe for forced labor. Maybe they would view you as incorrigible and just keep you there forever, right? And get some production out of you from the labor over there. Now, if you went before the Politburo and said that, either the firstborn should be killed, or that women should be killed after having 3 children, or it is a moral duty to cut off your big toe, okay, and you said something like that, well, by then these people have kind of a conception of mental illness. We're talking about the 1930s now. They have a conception of mental illness, so you probably wouldn't be sent to the Gulag, right? And they would recognize that your ideas wouldn't really gain traction, and you're not really an enemy of the state for saying these kinds of crazy stuff, and you're certainly not a threat. But they would find your ideas repulsive, and they may send you to the loony bin. They may send you to a psych ward institution for saying these things. And so, I think that there's a clear pattern emerging, right? Just through this thought experiment, going to Eridu, Marduk, and Moscow. We can evaluate the reactions we get to ideas to get a signal for where the big wrong at a given place and time is. For some things, you will get a big emotional reaction, and a negative emotional reaction for either proposing something or questioning. Right? If you propose killing the firstborn or killing women after having 3 children, this will be met with a very strong negative reaction everywhere you go, in every place and time. Okay? Everywhere. This is key. It is a universal negative reaction. Right? Remember the Bible story about Passover, about killing the firstborn. Okay? That was a very repulsive thing that these people did because of some religious belief, all right? And so you could say that, well, no, some people did actually do this kind of stuff, but even then it was recognized as a very repulsive thing to do. But they did it anyway because of some belief they had, okay? So, right, the fact that people did it at various places and times does not mean that proposing that you do this didn't yield a strong negative emotional reaction. It certainly did. Okay. So that's what you have. You have things that produce a strong negative emotional reaction everywhere, right? And then there's another category of statements, right? If you argue certain technical things that they do, right? Say you argue that certain chariots, irrigation systems, steel mills, mining techniques, that some of these things are inefficient, they will quickly learn and they will adapt what you teach to them without fuss. So long as what you say produces the desired results, they'll go, oh, this works, all right, we're going to do this, blah, 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 blah. Right? So we have statements that are universally met with a negative reaction. We have technical statements that are met with, not much of a negative reaction at all. But then there's a third category, right? That evoke a historically specific negative reaction, okay? And that is key. Historically specific negative reaction. In the Soviet Union, they cared about Marx, not Enki or Marduk. In Babylon, they cared about Marduk, not Enki or Marx. In Eridu, they care about Enki, not Marduk or Marx. Okay? In the United States, they care about Martin Luther King, not Enki, Marduk, or Marx. In each case, they have their specific negative reaction to these beliefs being questioned. Okay? They are very strong negative reactions regarding ideas that are specific to their place and time. All right? And when you have that, when you have a very strong emotional reaction to questioning a belief of a certain people, and this is a very specific thing, right? It's only found in a certain place at a certain time. That's a red flag that this is a big wrong belief that they have, right? If it's historically specific and produces a very negative reaction when questioned, that's a sign that it's one of the big wrongs. Okay. Now it's possible that you could have people say in Mesopotamia, and they believe that a certain plant replenishes the soil when it doesn't actually replenish the soil, and so they have a false belief. But then you go to them and explain to them and show them that it doesn't actually replenish the soil, they then stop doing it. That's not what I'm talking. That's not a big wrong belief, right? That's just a technical error in day-to-day life. Okay, that's not what I'm talking about, right? The big wrong involves generally what is labeled religion and ideology, right? Which are functionally the same. The same. I mean, they transition into each other, and the principles apply to both, identically, right? Religion is ideology, religion is ideology. So, ideas at any place in time can generally be broken down into three categories. Sometimes it can be blurry, right? Whenever you project kind of there are two kinds of people in this world, okay? Whenever you put forth these sort of general rubrics, reality's always messier than this, granted. But I still think that these three, I still think that ideas generally fall into three categories. One is universally repugnant ideas, right? Or ideas it is universally repugnant to challenge, such as the right to breathe, or the right to keep your fingers, or the right to live after having 3 children, or universally repugnant ideas that it is universally repugnant to challenge, or universally repugnant proposals, such as women should be killed after having 3 children, or firstborn should always be killed, right? These are universally repugnant ideas, right? The second is technical ideas, which is self-explanatory. Better chariots. And the third is specifically repugnant ideas. So when we look for the big wrong, we're looking for very strong, historically specific negative reactions to questioning. Now comes the hard part. Right? Fast forward to the present, and you tell people in the United States that Marx was a false prophet, that Marx was wrong, and just about everyone in the United States, including even at the insane asylums of university social science departments, even most of them would agree. Right? I think, I don't have the data on hand, but I believe only about 12% of people employed at university social science departments, only about 12% are still Marxists anymore. And that's as high a number as you're going to get. You go out to the general population, it's even less. Right? Marxism is basically dead in the United States, to the extent it was ever really alive. So you say that, and you say, and everyone, just about everyone would agree, but there would be a strange sense that you're why are you talking about Marx? No one's a Marxist anymore. And a lot of liberals get really annoyed when conservatives, quote unquote, do this, because it's like, okay, that's fine, but are you implying that I'm a Marxist? Because they're trying to think, why are you doing this? Why are you berating Marx? Do you think I'm a Marxist? And so they'll get kind of annoyed, right? But anyway, Marx is really not central to many people in the world anymore, right? I mean, of course, it's central to millions upon millions of people, given the population of the world, and 1% is millions and millions of people. But relatively speaking, it's not a very large number of people who really hold to Marxism anymore. Today in the United States, right, where do you get very strong negative reactions? What beliefs produce very strong negative reactions when questioned and are historically specific to a place and time? Well, I think in the United States this basically means race, civil rights, slavery, World War II, and the Holocaust. Right? If you go to China, India, or Japan, or Thailand, where they have Nazi-themed restaurant, and you argue either that the Holocaust numbers are inflated, or that there were no homicidal gas chambers, that they were just labor camps with a high mortality rate, mind you, but just labor camps, and that there wasn't 1.5 million who died at Auschwitz. There was only around 100,000. Sad to be sure, but what does that compare to the Eastern Front? Right? You say that at least half of the testimony from Nuremberg regarding all the camps in the Allied zone of occupation contradicts now even mainstream historians. All right, if you say this to people in China, India, or Japan, you'll get a mixture of interest or disinterest. Right? Maybe they would listen to you and go, "Oh, that's kind of interesting. A lot of people in the West can believe something that the way you describe it sounds so obviously false. What silly beliefs these Westerners have, right?" Or they may go, "Oh, well, I don't really care." In the same way that if you went to explain to somebody for example, the middle of Kansas, that Buddhism is a crock of shit, and let me put the real expose on Buddhism and how Buddhism is a crock of shit. Maybe they would be interested, but but not as interested as people in China would be. Okay, and they wouldn't have a negative emotional reaction to your dismantling of Buddhism. Now, the people you speak to, like if you're, questioning the Holocaust in China, India, and Japan, the people you speak to may or may not be persuaded by your arguments. Maybe they will, maybe they won't, maybe they just won't care and just say, "Hey, I need to go to my anime convention, whatever," because that's what they have in Japan. But the key is they won't have a strong emotional reaction to what you're saying about the Holocaust. They don't see questioning the Holocaust as a morally offensive act, in the same way that you and I don't see questioning Marxism or the Bolshevik Revolution or Buddhism as a morally offensive act. Right? And the reason is that Marxism and Bolshevism and Buddhism, that's not our religion. Right? In the same way that the Holocaust is not part of China's religion. Okay? And so you can talk about it openly without the strong negative emotional reaction. Okay? What is and isn't heresy is dependent on place and time. And so when you're looking for, the big wrong, specific negative emotional reactions, right? So, negative emotional reactions to specific questions, to specific attempts at revision, that's where the big wrong probably lies. If you say, for example, go to someone and say, "Hey, here's what some historians have been saying about the Crimean War. I think they got it wrong. I think that the Turks were actually trying to invade the Crimea and Russia was preemptively attacking, and the only reason Britain entered the war was power politics to prevent Russia from having access to the Mediterranean and becoming able to challenge British naval hegemony, blah, 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 blah. right? You say all this sort of stuff, and most people they just won't care. They just don't fucking care. Uh, so revision itself is not something that people are generally opposed to, right? I can have a revisionist account of the War of 1812, and I can say that, and the people I present my case to, they may be persuaded, they may not be persuaded. Usually they are persuaded just because they don't know that much about the War of 1812. But that's not really the point. The point is that they're not morally opposed to questioning the specifics of the War of 1812, whereas they are morally opposed to questioning the specifics of the Holocaust, right? Because the Holocaust is one of these sacred tribulations. Right? Sacred tribulations. Hebrews, slaves in Egypt, right? Pharaoh, Pharaoh, oh baby, let my people go, right? It's a sacred tribulation. They were slaves. They were meant to, right? And it's bogus, right? There's this story that they're enslaving these Jews to build the pyramids. Well, of course, the Jews weren't there at the times the pyramids were built, and there's really no evidence. I'll link an article to that. I don't really remember off the top of my head how we know that it's bogus. There's been some accounts that the Hebrews in Hebrews in Egypt were mercenaries, and then they traveled across the Sinai. And the reason that the Pharaoh was pursuing them is that they were sacking various towns on their way into the land of Canaan, or the Levant. And the Pharaoh, in response to the sacking of towns, said, well, I can't stand for that, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in and get them. I'm going to send some troops to go get them. Moses knew how to get through the Nile Delta. Right? He didn't part the Red Sea. He just knew a path through the Nile Delta. The Pharaoh's army did not, and so the Pharaoh's army they weren't drowned in the Red Sea, but they were kind of bogged down in the Nile Delta, and the Hebrews got away. The Hebrews described the land of Canaan as super immoral and worthy of being struck down, which is a great way to rationalize going into Canaan and conquering the area and setting up the Hebrew state in there. Okay, so what you see, and is what I just said, is that what actually happened? I don't know. But what I do know is that there's no real records of Hebrews having been slaves in Egypt. That's what is known. Right? We know that there's no real records of Hebrews having been slaves in Egypt. So this idea that they were an oppressed group and they were, the Pharaoh, we got to escape the Pharaoh, let's escape to go to the promised land in Canaan. That's a sacred tribulation. And it's also a very self-serving story. So when you read that, wouldn't one be a bit skeptical? Well, the way you paint it out, this Pharaoh guy seems to be a comically evil person. And what exactly are you? This seems to be so over the top. Over the top. Romans feeding Christians to the lions just because they were Christian. That ended up that's actually a falsehood as well. Now, I'm sure there were some Christians who were sent to the lions, right, as criminals, to be basically butchered for the amusement, right? That's their that's how their death sentence was carried out. But there's no evidence that they were systematic, that the Romans, took a bunch of Christians and then fed them to the lions just because they were Christians. That's a myth, right? And generally, the myth of Christian persecution in the Roman Empire is kind of a myth. Right. I mean, there's a story about how Jesus was treated, okay, and how Jesus was treated badly. But it's actually the Romans who were being favorable to the Christians. Right? In fact, the Romans were the biggest protectors. Right. The real enemy of the Christians were not the Romans. It was anyway. So that's what. So we see the myth of the Hebrew slaves in Egypt, the myth of Christians being sent to the lions. Okay. The U.S. Revolution, right? There's this great myth that the British they're quartering our troops, they're having confiscatory taxes. Well, they had less taxes than existed in in the UK. Right, the colonialists were paying fewer taxes than existed in the UK. Moreover, the Britain, part of the reason they needed to tax the colonies was because Britain had just finished fighting a war on their behalf, right? A war against France, in order to get more land for the 13 colonies, right? Originally they were along the coast, but they fought a war to push inland to give the colonies more land to then expand further inland. And really, what Britain was asking was for the colonies, which were actually quite wealthy at the time. Going off the top of my head, I believe there were roughly 11 million people in the UK at the time, and about 2.6 million in the colonies. So the colonies had a population, and they had some wealth. They were wealthier per capita than the than the Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, right? And so asking them to pay some of their war costs, a war that was fought on their behalf, is not totally unreasonable, right? So what was the revolution about? Well, it was about basically it was about welfare, right? And then there's a story that and so that's the idea that they're just uniquely put upon, right? For example, at the beginning they reference the tax on spirits and carriages, which is the tax on booze. Well, interestingly enough, following the Revolutionary War, the Continental Congress instituted a tax on spirits and carriages, just like Britain had been doing. This then led to a revolt, which was put down militarily. Okay, so you see the Continental government doing the exact same thing that led to a revolt against Britain. Only this time the revolt was much smaller and the armies were domestic and put it down very easily. Okay, so we talk about, the Sacred Tribulation, they're taxing us so hard. Well, the Continental Congress quickly enacted all the taxes that the UK was doing, right? And moreover, the taxes that the UK was doing was completely justified, right? It was completely justified because not only was the Continental, because the UK had just finished fighting the war against the French, right, in order to get land for the 13 colonies that they desperately needed. Okay. Anyway, that's a myth, right? And there's all sorts of myths about how the United States overcame the military force of the greatest power in history. You know what's funny is that this revolt against Britain came at a time when Britain was at war with France, Spain, Holland, and a country in India called Mysore. Okay, so what it seems to me is that you had a bunch of people in the in what became the United States who wanted to have a revolution when it looked like Britain was weak, when Britain was overextended, because a clique of people in Philadelphia wanted to be in charge, and they thought, well, this is our great opportunity. Britain right now is grossly overextended. That's what we can do, and they would have lost. Even with Britain being as overextended as it was, they would have lost. Right? And that's how bad and how badly organized the colonies were. Right? They would have lost if not for French intervention. So the story of they're so put upon. These are some of the wealthiest people in the world at the time, right? The people of the 13 colonies were certainly wealthier than the typical person in Britain, right? So that's a sacred tribulation myth that is that's bogus. Now a lot of people, increasingly that myth is it's a mixture of past tense and present tense as for how many people actually believe it anymore. I think increasingly fewer and fewer people believe in the sacred tribulation of the U.S. Revolution anymore, right? But there was a time when they did, when the U.S. Revolution was this religious thing, and you have the paintings and you have the statues that fit right in with a religious mold, right? And they're still kind of there, and increasingly it's becoming something that's sort of quaint, something that's sort of silly, and even to foreigners a bit embarrassing, right? Because it's so obviously, transparently false, and people are starting to figure it out. But it wasn't always the case, right? People used to truly believe that they were fighting against British oppression, and they fought against the terrible tyranny of King Bubble Pants. So, but yeah, you have that, and you also had a similar story with the Bolshevik Revolution, right? The story was, these horrible monarchists and these apologists for the monarchists were fighting against the Bolsheviks, who just wanted to give the people land and bread and put the monarch and just wanted their own freedom from the horrors of monarchy and autocratic rule. Okay, when the reality was that there were a few monarchists, but most of the groups that the Bolsheviks were fighting against were the anarchists of Nestor Makhno, were Ukrainian nationalists who wanted to set up a democratic Ukrainian government, Belarusian nationalists who wanted to set up a democratic Belarusian government. Okay, the UFA directory, which labeled themselves as socialist. Okay. Kerensky, who was actually the head of Russia at the time when the revolution began to break out, called himself a social democrat. Okay, I mean, and so who were the Bolsheviks fight? They weren't fighting monarchists, and moreover, the idea that the monarch was particularly oppressive may have been kind of true. That's hard to say. I'd need to research more about that. I think that's probably another big turd of a myth. But that aside, even if we grant all of the scorn heaped upon the Russian monarchy, that's not who they were primarily fighting in the Civil War. They're primarily fighting, the Northern Army, the Army of the Don, the Volunteers Army, Nestor Makhno, the UFA directory, the Primorsk government, right? These weren't monarchist groups. These were social democrat groups. So that sacred tribulation is a crock of shit. The Bolsheviks could have ended the war a lot sooner than they did, if they would have been content with a smaller territory. Right? They could have taken the area stretching from Leningrad to Moscow and most of the ethnic Russian area north of the Don, of the Donbass region, and could have ended the war a lot sooner. Right? But they didn't want it. They wanted it all. They wanted to right? They wanted it all. Right? That's why the war went on as long as they did, is because the Bolsheviks were so belligerent and demanding. They were willing to prolong the civil war and have all those people die from the war and die from the dislocation of war, right? and the starvation from war, right? Just so that they could make sure that they had as much of the former Russian Empire as they could. Now, they weren't able to get it all. Poland got away, Finland got away, and the Baltic states got away. And so a lot of people look at the Soviet Union and their invasion of Finland and their invasion of Poland and their invasion of the Baltic states. It's like, well, how can the Soviet Union justify doing that? Well, remember that these were areas that were formerly part of the Russian Empire, and the Soviet Union saw itself as entitled to the entire territory of the former Russian Empire. And so really, they saw the invasion of Poland as a continuation of the Russian Civil War. Right? In your mind, the Russian Civil War lasted from 1917 to 1920, what was it, 22? I think it was 22. And that was the end of it. Right? Well, that's like your opinion, man. But in Moscow, the war hadn't ended. Right? Finland was still, an illegitimate state in their eyes. Poland was still an illegitimate state in their eyes, and the Baltic states were illegitimate states in their eyes, and they were going to do what they thought they had to do to get those back. Okay. So, but anyway, so with the Bolsheviks, they have the story about the sacred tribulation. No, there was a tribulation that they themselves forced upon all these Russian peoples, right? They were belligerent and trying to conquer, right, to take away the the Ukrainian Free State and the Ukrainian National Congress, I believe it was called, right? So yeah, so you see that there. So that's another. So the U.S. Revolution is a sacred tribulation myth. The Bolshevik Revolution, sacred tribulation myth. The Christians being fed to the lions, sacred tribulation myth. The Hebrews being slaves in Egypt, oh, that's another sacred tribulation myth. The Maoist Revolution, I don't know enough about that, but my guess is that's probably another sacred tribulation myth. My guess is that Mao could have had a territory and could have just said, "All right, this will be communist China." Right after World War II, the Soviet Union invaded Manchuria, and a lot of people are thinking, "Well, why did they invade Manchuria?" When they knew, like diplomatically, they couldn't hold on to that territory. The Soviet Union couldn't hold on to Manchuria, so why did they go through all the trouble of invading it? Well, they gave it to communist China. Right? They said, "Oh, sure, we'll give Manchuria back to China. We'll give it not to Chiang Kai-shek. We'll give it to Mao," and that's what they did. And that functioned, and that, in addition to all the aid that he was getting from the Soviet Union, functioned as a real effective power base for Mao. Beforehand, Mao was kind of, and his communists were kind of sequestered off in, the boonies nowhere land and in kind of, not in the deserts of inland China, but kind of the mountains that precede the deserts of inland China, right? Mao was basically able to keep out the Chiang Kai-shek, but he wasn't able to really make any headway anywhere else. Once they got Manchuria, now he has a real power base, and combined with aid from the Soviet Union and some genuine popular support amongst the Chinese, eventually was able to take over China. Right. And when you look at, I know, for example, there's a story about the Long March, the revolution originally around Nanking, then spread further into an area around the Guangdong area, I believe, sort of in not on the coast, but sort of southerny China, and then they did another long march up into the mountains where they kind of sat and simmered for a long time. I don't really remember the dates. I'm not an expert on the Chinese Civil War, as you can probably infer, but of course that creates a lot of fodder for the idea of a sacred tribulation. Oh, we were expelled from Nanking, then we were in Guangdong, and then we were expelled from Guangdong, and then we went up to the mountains where we were in exile, effectively. But the thing is, it was a self-imposed exile, and while apparently the revolution was sparked off by a series of anti-communist purges in the from the nationalist government, so they're responding to purges. Well, why were they purging the communists? Right. You need to consider, why were they purging the communists? Were they purging who else were they purging? Who else was the nationalist government purging? Right? Did the nationalist government have a habit of purging anybody who had, differing political views from the nationalist government? Right? I don't know of any evidence of. I mean, that's never been said to me that they had, but they in particular purged communists. Why did they in particular purge communists? Well, I don't know. Perhaps I need to read more, but just based on how communists behaved in Korea, how they behaved in Vietnam, how they behaved in Europe. These are really, they're religious fanatics, all right, and they're really willing to kill. They're really nasty people, right? Maybe they're made nasty by their ideology, or maybe they're just nasty inherently and thus are attracted to the ideology that justifies them being nasty. Or maybe it's a mixture of both. Maybe they are inherently nasty, and so they're attracted to something that justifies it, which causes them to be even more nasty. However it happens, what you see, communists just in general are thuggish people. Wherever they crop up, they always do they're very thuggish. right? And so that's probably the anti-communist purges in nationalist China were probably a response to that, right? But anyway, so I don't know enough about Mao to say that that's a sacred. Well, first off, I know it's a sacred tribulation story, right? It's treated as that. It's used as that. Look, we were put upon. We tried to escape. Blah blah blah. In fact, we even stood with the Chinese people when the Japanese invaded, right? So they have a big sacred tribulation story. Whether it's true or not, I'm leaning to the idea that it's bogus, right? But I don't know that for sure. But what I do know for sure is that it is used as that, right? If it's true, okay. If it's true, but it's still used as that, right? So when you look at, say, the plight of blacks in the United States, I think I'll probably try to upload this tomorrow. Actual data and sources regarding slavery in the United States. Just talking about slavery, and then maybe another video talking about the horrors of Jim Crow and segregation. Oh my! But I think that's another sacred tribulation myth. Right. It's certainly used as such, right? The Sacred Tribulation first is, they were taken from their home in Africa by these white people who went into the middle of Africa and found some tribes and threw nets over them and right. All these stories. And then they were sent to the Americas where they were forced to work hard labor, harder than any white people have ever had to work, right? Which is another myth. They actually worked fewer hours than white people in the Americas did, right? And of course, and they were actually enslaved not by white people but by other blacks who then sold them to a few white people. So. And whenever blacks in the U.S. South ever got the chance, they of course bought slaves as well. I mean, they were not morally. First off, we know that the blacks in Africa were not morally above slavery, right? Most of the blacks in Africa stayed in Africa. Okay, some of them went to the Americas, but most of them were slaves and they stayed in Africa. And there were plenty of black people. In fact, free blacks had a higher rate of slave ownership than free whites. Anyway, but that's another sacred tribulation. Oh, we were enslaved. It was so horrible. We were so put upon, right? Even though you had a literacy rate that was higher than most white people in the world. You lived longer than most white people in the world, including several populations within the United States. Right. And now the United States was especially wealthy at this time per capita compared to Europe. Right. But I mean, if you compare these Africans to the standard of living that, say, a Russian had, it was higher in life expectancy and in height. Right. Even though today blacks are. Anyway, I'm not going to get. It's a sacred tribulation, right? And so when you question it, people get really butt mad about it because that's their story, right? But the thing is, what they don't get is that their stories have been around for a very, very long time, and they're always wrong, right? If they're specific, if they're a historically specific belief that has a very strong negative emotion when questioned, right? That's a sign of a big wrong. Now, let me. I want to pre-retort to an argument that I get a lot, or not a lot, but I sometimes get, which is that I'm the same way in this because when I hear white people being blamed for X, Y, and Z, I have a negative emotional reaction to that, right? And this is but the thing is, and this is a specific historical negative emotional reaction to white people being blamed for X, Y, or Z, right? For Africa's poor. See, white people, colonialism. Well, how was Africa before colonialism? Don't change the subject. I would say no, because that is not, because for lack of a better term, racial identification, right? When you blame white people for X, I take that personally. Okay, that's not historically specific. Right? That's not historically specific. That is something that most normal people do for most of history. Now, what has happened in Western Europe and the United States is that a bunch of white people have lost their minds in that they look at these white people who conquered Africa and say, oh, that's not me, that's not us, that's not me, white people. I'm part of the good white people, not the bad white people. And so they have a distinction, right? And so they do actually have group identity and group solidarity, right? But they just distinguish themselves from those other bad white people. Now, if you go to these people and say, actually, hey, guess what? Liberals are full of shit. Here's brain scans that say so. Oh, guess what? Liberals actually make less money than conservatives. Oh, hey, guess what? Liberals actually have lower IQ than conservatives. Hey, guess what? Tea Partiers actually score higher on scientific literacy tests than and you say all that pisses them off, right? Because you're attacking their actual identity group, right? How they actually identify themselves as, right? And so if I, identify, and so for me to take umbrage when my biological race is attacked, right? That's not a historically specific thing, right? That's something that people have done for a very long period of time. And so when you look at the big wrong, it's historically specific. I really hate using the term racism, but I think I think this is a good line to explain it. Racism is not historically specific, and because it's not historically specific, it's not going to be one of the big wrongs in the way that a religious or ideological cult is going to be a big wrong. Right? Going around saying white race is best race is something people have been doing for a very long period of time. It's not a historically specific thing. It's not something that needs to be conditioned. It's something that is innate and actually has to be conditioned against. Right? So So I mean it's possible that I can be saying things that are incorrect. I mean that's certainly up for revision, but the idea that I'm systematically that my brain has been systematically biased as a result of some sort of ideology could be, but I think the fact that my racial sentiments are historically normal is some evidence against that possibility, right? Let me put it this way. Now you could say, well, just because it's historically normal doesn't mean it. Just because it's historically normal doesn't mean it doesn't cloud your judgment. Right? Okay, so you have racial bias or racial favoritism, we'll say. Right, and it's historically normal, but it's a historically normal thing that is bad. That's possible. But let me put it this way. If you have a family and you have a daughter or a son, parents tend to imagine their children as being better than they really are. And that is a bias. Now, what you could say is that, well, in order to correct this, we really need to teach parents that their children are not, in fact, better than they really are. That their children are not, in fact, better than other parents' children. That their children are just as good as or maybe their children are better based on some objectives. But that aside from that tell them that basically get them to have a more realistic view of what their children are like. Now you could say that causes and so what we need to do is correct against their bias, against their favoritism towards their own children, in terms of their judgment of them. Right? You could say that, but I would say, but if you correct their pro-children bias, what you're probably going to be doing is introducing all sorts of, how do I put this? If you correct their bias in favor of their own children, you're probably and you manage to do so. Let's say you succeed in doing so, and they no longer have a more rosy view of their own children than they do of other children. I think that if you've done that, you're probably going to make them somehow more psychologically damaged than if their inherent biases were allowed, right? Because that's the hell of inherent biases, is that your inherent biases are 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 natural, right? They are evolved, and so I see that as it's being you're less likely to be pathological than you are with a conditioned bias, right? And I say this because an inherent bias, for example, bias in favor of your own children or bias in favor of your own race, that kind of bias is it's less likely to lead to other pathologies simply because those biases have proven effective in evolutionary terms. Okay, so they've proven effective in evolutionary terms, which means they clearly didn't conflict. They didn't make someone dysfunctional, right? And moreover, like how deep is the bias of say family favoritism or race favoritism, right? Like, I don't. And in fact, I think for me to even say this is evidence that it's not like an ideological bias, right? Because I can sit back and question it. I can sit back and question, my own racial favoritism, right? And I can analyze it, recognize that I have it, and that's fine. However, let's take somebody who not only has an anti-Hitler bias, but has a deep-seated anti-Hitler bias, right? And you try to point to him, look, I think you have an anti-Hitler bias, and that's preventing you from ever possibly revising any of the beliefs you currently hold, right? They would look at that, and the concept in their mind of an anti-Hitler bias to them is just so completely, it's unthinkable to them, right? And let me put it another way. Well, you say the Ku Klux Klan was lynching blacks, but here's numbers that say otherwise. And I don't think and in fact, you look at the proportions of blacks that were lynched and the population of blacks in the South, it's actually proportional to the blacks today who are arrested for violent crimes, right? So the lynch mobs seem to be lynching blacks. I mean, they lynch whites as well, but they seem to be lynching blacks in about the same proportion as the current U.S. legal system is sending blacks to prison for violent crimes. Right? So isn't that kind of a coincidence? And I bring that up, and what people do is they immediately think, oh, so you're saying that lynching was justified? Well, case by case basis. I mean, given that there were over 3,700 of them against blacks, there was probably a few of them that were not justified, but probably most of them were. Okay. A very small number of blacks were lynched, right? So if they were just going around willy-nilly lynching blacks at every opportunity that they thought they could get away with, probably lynch a lot more. So, but of course I say that, but they can't even consider the possibility of the bias. For example, and you compare racial bias to family bias. Parents tend to be self-aware that they have a rosy view of their own children, an unrealistically rosy view of their own children. And so if you said to them, I think you have an unrealistically rosy view of your own son, the response would probably be is very often something like, well, yeah, but he's my son. Yeah, but he's my son. So you have a bias and you're aware of your bias and yet you continue to hold that bias? How strange, right? Yeah, but it's my race. Oh, so you have a bias and you're aware of that bias and you continue to hold that bias? Right. This is something that you don't see with biases that are, for lack of a better term, unnatural. Of course, I mean, this gets into a question, what is natural, what is unnatural? I think the viewer knows what I mean. Right? When they have a bias in favor of a religion, they tend to be far less likely to be aware of that bias, or aware of even the possibility that they have a bias. For example, you take a firm believer in Jesus and say, well, you say all this stuff, but maybe do you think that you perhaps have too much of a pro-Jesus bias? Right? You say that to a true believer, they're going to blow their gourd at you. Right? Same thing you say like a true believer, university social science, cult embedded person. And you say, you say all this horrible stuff at Hitler, but do you think maybe you have a little bit of an anti-Hitler bias? Right? They would just explode at you. An anti-Hitler bias? Are you insane? A pro-Jesus bias? Are you insane? An anti-Lucifer bias? Are you insane? A pro-Marx bias? Are you insane? A pro-Enki bias? Are you insane? A pro-Marduk bias? Are you insane? No, I'm not insane. Right? Or you go to a Catholic and say, I think you have a little bit of a bias against Lucifer, against the morning star. They would, what? A bias against Hitler? Are you insane? So, that is why I don't think that, it's not, and so that is why I put racial bias kind of in the same category as bias in favor to your children. It's not nearly as pernicious. Largely because if you have the bias, you are very much self-aware of it. It's not, and I think, I'm not exactly sure why it is. I'm not sure why synthetic or created beliefs, people tend to be more closed-minded about that. I'm not sure why, right? But they just do. They just tend to be more closed-minded if the belief is externally implanted into them, as opposed to more of a genetic belief. Genetic belief. Oh, a pseudoscience. Beavers have fucking genetic beliefs. They know how to build dams. Bees have genetic knowledge about how to operate. Right. So genetic knowledge is not pseudoscience. It's very well known in the animal kingdom. Right. And so genetic tendencies in humans to be for their own kin, and for more extended kin, people who look more like them. Right. For whatever reason, those like that inherent bias, right, racial bias and family bias, tends not to be as hard. Right? It tends not to be as absolute. Like I can recognize my bias, whereas and perhaps guard against it, perhaps. So I say, but people who are profoundly anti-Hitler or pro-Jesus or anti-Satan, or back in the old Soviet Union were anti-capitalist, exploitation, pro-Marx, pro-Lenin, they can't even conceive, like you're literally demonic, and so. Right, and so that's, but of course that's the big wrong. Right? It is a historically specific, externally implanted belief. Whereas these things that are universal, such as racial sentiment, right? Well, first off, they're never going to go away unless you change the genes. But barring that, they're never going to go away. But they also don't seem to lead to as many. Well, of course, this gets into into history. They don't seem to lead to wars. Now, of course, question, well, Hitler, race war. No, I don't think that was a race. But of course, that's then we have to go into why. Well, then why did Hitler invade the Soviet Union? What about the stuff he said about the Slavs in the speech? What about the invasion of Poland? But right, that's a whole another topic that I don't want to get into here because it's lots of stuff to talk about. All I wanted to talk about in this video was bias. Right, where is the wrong? And types of bias, and the and racial sentiment. Like, let me put it this way: you could create a sort of a problem with racial sentiment, but I think the problem with racial sentiment would only come out of a synthetic ideology. Right? Does that make sense? Like, Like, let's say you like. How do I explain this? People inherently have racial sentiment, right? They're inherently racist or whatever. Now, that could become problematic. On its own, it's really not problematic, okay? Any more than nepotism on its own is problematic. Okay, it's whatever. You have some favoritism towards your family first, second your race, third everyone else. Okay, so I mean maybe you could say there's some problems with that, but you know on the whole not right. On the whole, really not. The problem comes when there is an ideology of race, right? But the thing is, it's not. But that's just because there's something synthetic implanted in people's brains, right? Now they already have like a bias, right? Like parents have, oh, my kid's the best kid, and oh, white race is best race. Okay, so they already have this sort of bias, and most of them are even aware of it. For example, Benjamin Franklin, when he was talking about, he was saying, I would like to see the Americas filled with the sons of Europe, not the sons of Africa, right? And he said something like, and it may just be my own sentiment, and there may not be any rationality to it, but it's just some. So he was aware of it and all that stuff. But if you implant an ideology of race into them, and you say, white people are God's people, right, or the Jewish people are God's people, right? If you say that this certain group of people are chosen by God and divine, then that justifies slaughter. Then that becomes problematic, right? And it's not but it's not like, let me put it this way. Let's say you have a family, right? Or a very large family. And inherently this family has pro-family biases, right? That's just how people are. Right? And so and we know that that's not harmful. But let's say this family then suddenly begins to believe that their family is chosen by God, that their family has the right to enslave all other people on the planet, and they then get into positions of power, and then use the state to conscript soldiers to enforce their will, to make sure that they rule everything, and that they dominate everyone, and that they make all the rules. Okay, in that sense, the family sort of becomes problematic, but it's not. But that's not just normal family favoritism, right? That is a full-blown ideology that I guess piggybacks off of an inherent bias, but it's not the normal expression of that inherent bias, right? Whereas the normal expression of racial bias is, well, it's going to be closed borders. It's going to be closed borders country, right? It's going to be, well, we want to have a country that's just for our race and our people, right? We want to be in charge. We need to have a racial homeland, right, so that we can have a place, basically a safety valve in case things go wrong in the United States, right? And so that's the normal expression of it, right? The normal expression of racial favoritism, for example, in Europe, was, keep Britain white, okay, keep France white. Okay. It wasn't, exterminate the other races. So I have this sort of thought in my mind, and I keep trying to explain it here, but I'm not explaining it to my own satisfaction here. I can't really put it into words. I see a difference, and the only way I can really express it is to try to relate it to something that I think the audience already understands. They should understand racial bias as being inherently malign, but not malign, benign. Yeah, malign. Now, they should see it as being inherently benign, not malignant, but they don't. And so what I have to do is, and the reason they don't is because of all the brainwashing, because of all the stories about slavery and Jim Crow and the whole synthetic mythos that has been injected into their brain in the countries of Europe and its offshoots. Not in Asia, but in Europe and its offshoots. They've been injected with all these stories. And so they've come to see any kind of racial favoritism as malignant, right? even though they have. But here's the problem: biologically, they have it themselves, and so they feel a little bit guilty. They feel, oh, that's kind of a bad thing that is about me, and why do I have these little feelings here and there? Why do I have, you know, why do I feel less comfortable around people of other races? Oh, something's wrong with me, you know. And it's just stupid. No, nothing's wrong with you, right? You also feel more comfortable around people you know, right? People who are genetic, and the fact that you feel more comfortable around people who are genetically closer to you, that's just how people have been for forever. It's a biological thing, right? So you're normal. You're working as intended, and so right, and it's like family. It's like a family a bias, and so that is why I think. And so I'm trying to say that I'm going round and round and round in circles here because I'm not explaining this to my own satisfaction. But I don't think there's any other way to explain it further. I hope the audience kind of understands what I'm saying, kind of understands why I think there's a difference between racial bias and which is something inherent, an inherent bias, versus an inculcated belief system. Right? Like religion is an inculcated belief system, whereas racial bias is just something. It's like family bias. So, all right, I need to end this before I keep going around in circles even more.